Hi, it's Dr. Shona Halson here, and I'd like to invite you to join me on the Physical Performance Show on the 24th of October, where we'll be talking all things recovery in the 3-hour live stream event. So we're going to cover essentially 4 modules around recovery. We're going to talk about the fundamentals of recovery. We're going to talk about periodization and adaptation. We're going to bust some recovery myths, and of course we're going to cover the best recovery strategy we have, which is sleep. So I'm going to go through a range of different things, talking about how we can help you pick your best recovery strategy, but also talk about some of the different aspects where there might not be a whole lot of science, to really help you look at how you can use recovery to really enhance your performance.
Failure is not an option.
I've had my ups and my downs.
I think it's an absolutely breakthrough experience.
Welcome to the Physical Performance Show, the show designed to inspire the pursuit of your physical best performance. I'm your host, Brad Beer. Listen in as we delve into how the world's top physical performers achieve their success, as well as the highs, the lows, and the journey of getting there. Let's get ready, set, let's go. Welcome to the Physical Performance Show, brought to you by our upcoming live stream event featuring Associate Professor Shona Halson, who you just heard from, who will be sharing on all things recovery essentials for optimal performance. This live stream will be ideal for athletes of all levels, coaches and practitioners, and at the time of this episode's release, we are just 2 weeks away from this unique learning opportunity. During the live stream, as Shona outlined, you'll discover the hows of recovery, explore the scientific whys, and also benefit from some serious recovery science myth-busting. Tickets are just $49 from pogophysio.com.au/Dr. Shona Halson live stream. Oh, and the recording is available post the live stream if you are in a time zone that prohibits you being online from 3 to 6 p.m. on the 24th of October. Now, coming up on this week's episode of the Physical Performance Show, you will enjoy some preliminary teachings and learnings from none other than Associate Professor Shona Halson herself on this expert edition. During today's episode, Shona will share around this concept of periodizing your recovery, when to include recovery and when not to. Shona will also explore the role that belief plays when it comes to recovery modalities and agents. And of course, this is Associate Professor Shona Halson's return visit to the Physical Performance Show, having been one of our most popular expert editions to date. So if you have missed episode 190 featuring Shona, then be sure to jump back after this episode with your pen and paper for the many learnings that Shona shared during episode 190. By way of bio, Shona is currently an Associate Professor of the School of Behavioural and Health Sciences at the Australian Catholic University. Prior to Shona's current role, Shona spent 15 years in the capacity as a Senior Physiologist at the Australian Institute of Sport, and also fulfilled the role of the Director of the Australian Olympic Committee's Recovery Centre across 3 consecutive Olympic Games, 2008, 12 and 16. Shona has a PhD in exercise physiology, looking at the fatigue in cyclists, has well in excess of 100 peer-reviewed publications across athlete recovery, sleep, fatigue and travel to her academic name, consults to some of the planet's biggest organisations and leading sports teams, including Nike, and prior featured guest of the show, best-selling author Christie Ashwanden, author of Good to Go, referenced Shona as perhaps the world's leading expert on recovery. Now, if you enjoyed episode 190 in the past, I know you'll enjoy this current episode, episode 238. And if it's your first time learning from Shona Halson, get ready with your pen and paper. Here is my conversation with Shona Halson around all things periodizing recovery for the athlete and recovery belief effects. Dr. Shona Halson, it is the year 2020. And we are back recording again for the Physical Performance Show. You last featured on episode 190 in November 2019. So welcome back. And what has the good doctor been up to?
Thanks, Brad. Thanks for having me back. It only seems like yesterday. I know time seems to be just disappearing before our eyes, but so since it was November 2019, so have been doing some, obviously continuing the recovery work and a lot of research in sleep area, setting up some projects for next year, analysing some existing data, like I think a few of us are in the academic world are doing now that we've got some time on our hands. Still been doing some bits and pieces with some professional teams, some teams overseas that I work with around sleep and recovery. Still keeping busy, just no travel, which is, has its pros and cons. But essentially just keeping on the sleep and recovery work that we've been doing for a while.
You consult to, the highest levels of physical performance and corporate performance as well. How have you observed athletes, teams, people in the industry adapting to, as you mentioned, no travel and these COVID times?
It's been interesting. I think we've seen a couple of things in the sports that I work with anyway. I mean, there's certainly been some athletes who obviously are experiencing a range of different stresses, especially those who are, competing in or hoping to compete in Tokyo 2021. That has thrown a massive spanner in the works for a lot of people. I think the restricted training for some athletes has also been obviously just different. Some people doing some things they maybe wouldn't have done in the past, or trying to explore, different ways of training and different things that they're doing. And, anytime we get this change in schedules, a change in training, a change in stress, we often see that come about through changes in sleep. And of course, I've been working with a few athletes who've been in quarantine periods. Who are travelling back from their own country, back to a national team or back to the team that they're playing in, which is in another country. And, there's some challenges there around, not just training in quarantine, but, when you've got more time on your hands, what happens to your sleep schedule, and also, of course, what happens, psychologically can be interesting as well. So, look, I think on the whole, a lot of the athletes that I've worked with have been, have taken it on the chin and are doing things as good as they can, but not to say that it's not a struggle.
I've been fascinated, Shona, looking at some of the, say, in the athletics world, we've had Australian national records falling. Jessica Hull, the 5,000 metres, taking a few seconds off Benita Willis's long-standing record, and then just overnight, Stuart McSwain bringing down the 3,000 metre record. And we've seen the 5,000 metre record fall in the men's, the women's half marathon. Could you give your thoughts, or can you give your thoughts, Shona, on what might be driving this? Is it that without some of those annual performance pressures that athletes have been able to bank some good quality work and recover well from it without the travel schedules as well? What do you think might be at play with some of these great record performances we're seeing, if anything, through the effects of COVID?
Yeah, it is super interesting, and I think there's a lot of people having a lot of different theories and different ideas, and I think, one potential is that, it was only, a month or so ago that, people would have been preparing for peak condition anyway for Tokyo. So, people would have been, ideally in the best shape of their life, ready for Tokyo for a lot of these athletes. I think there's also, the travel thing can certainly play a part. And if there's less travel, we often see less illness, less fatigue. But then with that, we've had a lot of, and especially some teams in Australia who may go to Tokyo with having no international competition before they go, because they're essentially stuck training in Australia. So I think there's some pros and cons to the not travelling. There may also be some athletes, and I think, and I certainly don't know how the athletes that you were talking about, some of the track and field athletes have been training. But, for some forced downtime, if they have had some rest, is not altogether a bad thing. So for some people who, tend to push the limits a little bit, having a little bit of where they may not have been able to do the volume that they would have liked and maybe they're able to maintain intensity. Who knows? There could be some benefits there. So, look, I guess you'd expect people to be in pretty good shape if they were treating this period of time like they would treat in terms of preparation for an Olympics. But if they haven't and they've been having some downtime, well, we see that that's not always the worst thing that can happen. But I do agree that sometimes, we see, the more times an athlete travels, especially internationally, not just, travel fatigue and jet lag, but their increase of illness risk rises as well. So, maybe you can just get more consistency of training when you're not traveling as much. So, lots of different options there.
And I guess the challenge is that it's going to be different for every individual anyway, every athlete.
Absolutely.
It's not a blanket causation effect, is it? Shona, we have very excitedly snared you for the upcoming next physical performance show live stream. And we will be discussing, and you'll be sharing around, I should say, 4 key modules: the fundamentals of recovery, periodization and adaptation, sleep science, recovery science, mythbusters. And on this discussion today, I think it'd be nice as a lead-in if we dig a bit deeper on the recovery and adaptation side of things, and specifically this notion of periodizing, this recovery in terms of how it affects performance. So when to include recovery and when not to?
Yeah, it's the topic, I think, at the moment in recovery, and the question around adaptation and can you recover too much, and I think I'm going to be a bit of a typical scientist and say it depends, which is, the answer that everyone hates. But I think, and the thing that we can do in the live stream is dig a little bit more into this. It depends, what are the things that it depends on? So, each sport is potentially different. Each athlete might be different. Phases of training are going to be different. The types of recovery that you do might be different. Like, we don't say that you should periodize sleep, right? You should just sleep. So I think there's it depends means that, and the people that understand the different things that go into when you make these decisions and why you make these decisions, they're the ones that are starting to get quite sophisticated in the way that they go about planning their recovery. But I think, we don't train the same way every day in terms of the types of training that's done. Athletes don't eat the same now. We periodize, the nutrition and the different macronutrients and those kinds of things. So it's just the same thing now that we're getting a bit more elaborate with the recovery, and we match recovery to training ideally, but depending on the type of training and where you are in the training program, there may be some times where you might take away a little bit of recovery, where the idea is that you're maximising your adaptation. And, for the purpose of today, I think the really simple way of thinking about it is short-term goals versus long-term goals. And so if your short-term goal is to race really fast tomorrow and the next day and the next day, or you're in some kind of event where you're repeating your performances over time in a really short period of time, you're going to want to throw lots of recovery strategies at yourself so that you can be, maximally recovered to perform as well as you can. If your goal is, you want to race really fast in Tokyo 2021, you've got some time to build up some adaptation, build up some fatigue, recover appropriately, and be ready for that time frame to maximise your adaptation. So, and I think the thing that we often, and people say, recovery, all you want to do is have people recovered, and the training's important. I'm like, absolutely, training is important, and fatigue is important. No one is saying fatigue is bad. Fatigue is what we need. You need to be fatigued to drive the adaptation. And so it's certainly not that fatigue is the enemy. It's just placing it into the training program at the optimal time, so that your fatigue's balanced with your recovery for your goal. If it's a short-term goal, you want to have little fatigue and maximum recovery. If it's a long-term goal, you can experiment a little bit more with a bit more fatigue, a good taper, and building up your adaptation to perform when you want to at the best level that you can.
Two T-shirts jumped out there, Shona. The first for you would be "Fatigue is what we need."
Yeah, yeah, not a bad thing.
Dr. Shona Halson, and balancing the fatigue with recovery. But contextualized for the athlete's goal.
100%. And, I know that, obviously a lot of the listeners will be, track and field athletes, triathletes, etc. But if you're someone who is working with a rugby team who are playing week in, week out for rugby league, a relatively long season, you're thinking about week to week, and you're thinking about just getting through to the end of the to the end of the season, and every game is important, every week is important. Whereas for some other sports where you have one ultimate goal, which may be a little bit of time away, and not to say that you're not going to perform during in intervals prior to that, but they may not be so important, and you might train through the fatigue, you might compete through the fatigue, you're not tapered for certain events because that's essentially part of your training. So I think this idea that people want a black and white, do I recover or don't I recover? Do I use ice baths? Don't I use ice baths? It's unfortunately not that simple. And if you can work out based on some generalised advice when to include it and then when maybe to take it away, then you've got yourself some real advantages there.
Commonsensical, but obviously it's not always easy when you're in the middle of it trying to figure it out. But when to include it, short-term goals, short-term focus, you need to be at your best, you're going to try and maximally recover, use modalities, etc., like you mentioned. But if it's a longer-term approach, it might be okay, or most likely preferable to build up some fatigue and really stimulate, drive that adaptation.
Yes, exactly. And, individual preference too is important. And, if you're an athlete that's a bit prone to injury, maybe you want to take care of yourself a little bit more. If you're a swimmer and you're essentially in a lot of, your body weight supported in water for the majority of your life, then, your approach might be a little bit different to someone who's clocking up a lot of Ks on the road, where you've got that impact and that muscle damage.
And it makes me think, Shona, of actually the current episode of the show with Dutch Triathlon Federation's coach, Louis Delahaye, who is the current coach of the current female world cycling road champion, who I'm sure you're familiar with, Eminique Van Vleuten. And Louis said that when he shifted from cycling to the triathlon world, injuries were something he was dealing with regularly, whereas in the cycling world, apart from the trauma of falls and occasional
crashes,
episode of knee pain, injuries weren't as prevalent, largely because their body weight supported. So, as you say, it depends. It depends on the sport. It depends on the athlete.
Yeah, and I think if people are giving... If you're going to someone for advice and they're giving you a blanket answer and they're not asking questions about the sport and they're not asking questions around what phase of training are they in, and they're not asking questions around the individual and what do they like and what have they responded to well in the past and what makes them feel good, because, the science is not, we've got some good science, but it's still very early days. We do need to rely on the individual, especially when you've got really experienced athletes. I love it when I worked with the US women's soccer team before the World Cup, and and it's great. They're can tell you the best group ever to work with. But you sort of walk in there and you're asked to give advice to these athletes who are, one, very good, and two, a lot of them are very experienced, and they have. I think we don't ask athletes enough how they feel and how they respond and what they want to do and why they do some of the things they do. Because, not to say that every athlete has every answer, but they've worked out, a lot of them, how they do things and why they do things. So I think it's just as important that, yes, we give our expertise, but we listen to their experiences as well.
So if you walk into an environment like that, the US women's soccer team ahead of the World Cup, Shona, you've got a collection of individual athletes playing as a whole, obviously as a team.
Yep.
Practically, obviously you're asking lots of questions, as you say, to figure out what each of these athletes have figured out for themselves to determine that. That's a big job. My mind boggles. You boggled my mind last time. You're doing it again on how then you take the individual needs and layer that over the top of a team framework. How do you actually find your way through that?
Yeah, look, it is a challenge when it comes to things like recovery. It can be challenging. I think the teams that I've worked with that take a really individualized monitoring approach. So in terms of everyone's monitored and someone has the time to sit down and look at each individual's data, I think that's when you can get some really good insight. There's things like, yes, you can't have different training times based on, what time people want to preferably wake up in the morning. And, you can't have, 5 different temperature ice baths. In the practical world, it doesn't work. So I think the thing is to understand what things that you can take an individual focus on, and you can do that with sleep. We can monitor sleep. We can individualise the strategies to help improve an athlete's sleep, so we can take an individual focus there. You can understand when an individual may, if you're tracking them, when, this particular athlete might take a little bit longer to recover than another, and just understand that their training may need to be a little bit more individualised. But when it comes to the whole, you've got a time frame for recovery, and you've got potentially more options for recovery is the way that I would see it. So where you might have, an individual athlete might like compression and ice baths, say, for example. If you've got a team's environment, you may just have more options, if you can afford it, and you've got the human resources and the finances to be able to do it, having a few more different options for players so that they just can get the recovery that they want. So definitely more challenging in a team environment, but making sure that you have that individual focus within the team to understand, each of the players is important. Knowing
what things you can take an individual focus on. And Shona, I'm just curious, you said they were the best group to ever work with, the US women's soccer team. What made them so great to work with?
Yeah, look, there was just a commitment to excellence. I think there was just this enthusiasm and a keenness to learn. So when I was talking to them, I was not talking to them like they were school kids. There was like, let's talk about the mechanisms. Let's help you make good decisions. Just a group that had a culture of excellence. And so there was no questions around introducing anything that might have been a little different or something they hadn't done before. Yep, is this going to make us better? There's a good chance it will. We think it might. I think it's worth a try. It was like, absolutely, let's just do it. So, I have had that experience with a lot of, probably the couple of female team sports that have been at a high level. I've definitely seen that and I don't know if it's the difference between females and males, or I think sometimes when you get into high level professional teams, some of them earn a lot of money, and that can throw a little bit of a spanner in the works too. So look, I think that just the female athletes that I've worked with in a team sport, and the culture has been pretty incredible. So that doesn't hurt your cause.
Yeah, no, it's fascinating stuff. Shona, just to drive this learning home, let's look at the world of endurance sports, say distance triathlon at the moment. Most races have been cancelled. Say, if some athletes have a spot, for example, for the Hawaii Ironman triathlon for the 2020, which is now deferred to 2021, possibly.
Yeah.
In the case of this, so they've got a long-term goal. Practically, how might you suggest that they try and build up some of this fatigue and adaptation? It's very different to the athlete that's got a short-term focus where they're trying to throw everything at themselves they can to maximise recovery.
Yeah.
How might you advise, and obviously this is a broad open scenario, but what might be some practical applications?
Yeah, so I guess if you sort of think about, when many athletes would sort of intentionally overreach or push themselves in a really intensified training block, if it's, we've always got to balance this out with the risk of injury. And so, adding some recovery can potentially be good in that area. Maybe. We don't have hard and fast science, but maybe. But if you're going through a block where you're just adding some, you're doing a really hard block of training, maybe you might want to not throw recovery at yourself every day. It might just be more like after 1 or 2 days, and just pick a couple of recovery obviously your nutrition and your sleep are non-negotiables, right? But things, your ice baths and things like that, you might not have a huge recovery focus in that time frame. So say you normally do 4 recovery sessions a week, you might do 2 or 3. or even just two, one or two maybe, depending on what you're used to. And then when you're, especially then, if you've got time for a taper, or after that you're doing some just more back to more normal training, the way that we sort of look at it is, you're not really, your drive to recovery is, you want to recover, you want to do, you want to be able to get there and train as good as you can. But if you've got a bit of extra fatigue and you're not injured and you're just able to push through some of that, you might find that you're getting some increased adaptations. But it's just making sure that you give yourself the time to taper and recover in for your important event. So, I've worked with athletes, example, swimmers who may not do much recovery throughout the year. But then when they're, if they're doing 2 taper blocks a year in preparations for, say, nationals or world champs or Olympics, they'll do, taper blocks and then a lot of recovery and competition. So that is an approach that you can take, although I am very aware that obviously with triathlon you're increasing your risk, you've got an increased risk of injury in comparison to swimming, so you want to make sure that you're looking after yourself as well. It's just a bit of a balance between maybe thinking I can take a little bit of recovery away, I'm going to monitor myself, whatever that looks like, whether it's just having some insight and just thinking back and, just paying attention to yourself and making sure that you're not getting too much of a hole, but knowing that it's okay at certain phases to not, I think that's the key. It's like, we don't need to do 5 recovery sessions a week when you're in a training phase, when you've got a fair amount of time before your major event.
You just mentioned, self-reflection, monitoring how you're feeling. That was a topic we explored in detail on episode 190 around the importance of subjective data, checking in with yourself, the perception of effort. You mentioned back in episode 190 that decoupling effect, when we might be starting to notice that the output is feeling a lot harder than it might have been previously. So I'd recommend listeners jump back if you missed episode 190 on that. Shona, before we look at belief effects around recovery or in recovery, you just used the T word, the taper word. I'd be fascinated to hear from your great science mind around physiologically, in simple terms, what happens in a taper block or a taper process? What are we trying to achieve through tapering?
Yeah, my good friend Inigo Mujica, who's like the tapering man, I try to take his philosophy on some of these things, but it's really, we spend, when you're doing a lot of training, you spend obviously a lot of your life in fatigue, and what you're trying to do in the taper space is take away as much fatigue as you can, keep the adaptation there, keep the performance there, keep your ability to train there, but just taking away that fatigue component. We know that the body adapts during rest. You adapt, you regenerate, you repair, all those R words all happen obviously when you're at rest. If there are some athletes who, if you could train 24 hours a day and that actually work and improve your performance, they would. But it's not possible, because we know that the good stuff happens during recovery. We need the training, but we need the recovery to adapt to that. And I just think of taper as a big block of time where you're adapting, where you're repairing, where you're making sure you're taking away that as much fatigue as you can to make sure that you're ready for that event.
That can be the back of that T-shirt, Shona. The front says, we need fatigue, and the back can say, we know that the good stuff happens during recovery. It's a perfect shirt. And it makes me think of that golden maxim, which was included in Christie Ashwanden's best-selling book, Good to Go, and that's the Dr. Shona Halsons, which is the only training you're benefiting from is the training that you are recovering from. And it's been really nice. I've heard that repeated back several times now in different formats, that seems like your messaging's getting out there.
Yeah, look, and I think that, as I said, fatigue's not bad, it's not evil, but there are times when you don't want it. And, that's when we have to be really cautious of having excessive amounts of fatigue. And is exactly right. You can't train. That's where we see overreaching and overtraining and these excessive fatigue blocks, is when it's train, and almost no recovery. So you're not really getting a huge amount of benefits from that training if you don't allow the recovery. Now, I know we're talking about, taking away recovery during some periods around adaptation, but you're still getting, we're saying that you need to get some recovery in your taper time or making sure you're recovered during competition. So you're exactly right. The good stuff happens when you're recovering from the training.
I recall, Shona, Dick Telford, prior featured guest of the show, obviously well-known Australian athletics coach, no doubt a colleague of yours from your Canberra days, and he shared that little maxim, a taper is removing the cloud of fatigue. And it's just I thought, so memorable and makes sense.
Yeah, it does. And I think, taper gets interesting because, I find tapering interesting, obviously, from a taking away the fatigue perspective, but you also see people get sick in the taper. And there's a few people, having different thoughts around why that might be, but I see people change the way they sleep when they taper. And some of that is voluntary and some of it is not. So some of it is because you don't have the drive to sleep like you previously did. You're not doing as much training, you're not as tired. And, some athletes, I think I see it's like, oh, I can have a life now and, I don't need to sleep. I'm not training as much and, I can maybe stay up a bit later or, so I think I have seen some pretty significant changes in sleep during a taper period, which hasn't been, the best thing for the athlete. So, tapering is really interesting and there's obviously a lot of science. And as I said, Inigo's done a lot of work in that area and, what sort of taper do you do? And do you have some, you keep the intensity, but you lower the volume and you do an increase right before you there's all these different theories. But, I think people who really are experienced in a taper know, and athletes have done it a lot, kind of work out what works for them and what doesn't work. I think the worst thing is when you hear an athlete, they for some reason they do a PB like a week after the major event and you go, oh, you missed it. You missed, your taper was off. You weren't fresh enough.
You're listening to Associate Professor Shona Halson on this and Expert Edition episode 238 around all things periodising athlete recovery and belief effects in recovery. Support for today's show comes from our upcoming live stream event featuring Associate Professor Shona Halson herself. This is a unique 3-hour learning opportunity, as you heard at the top of the show. The live stream's titled Recovery Essentials for Optimal Performance, and it will explore 4 key learning modules. Session 1, Fundamentals of Recovery. Session 2, Recovery, Periodization and Adaptation. Session 3, Sleep Science. Session 4, Recovery Science, Mythbusters. All participants of the live stream will receive a post-event recording along with copies of the presentation via PDF. This is a learning opportunity not to miss if you're an athlete, coach or practitioner in the field from just $49. Tickets are available over at pogophysio.com.au/Dr. Shona Halson live stream and secure your seat from just $49 Australian dollars. Our prior live stream featuring Stephen Seiler was attended worldwide. So once again, if you are in a time zone outside of Australia that's prohibitive to you being on the live stream, then still go ahead and register as you will receive a recording post the live stream's completion. For now, let's jump back on this pre-live stream episode featuring Associate Professor Shona Halson on all things periodizing recovery for the athlete and belief effects in recovery.
Shona, we mentioned Louis Delahaye just before the current episode as we record, the current guest as we record. But Louis actually said something that I thought was so simple, and I'd be interested in your thoughts with your science mind on this. He said, I know if a taper's gone well for an athlete because they feel good.
I love it. And you know what?
And they're happy.
Yeah. It's not rocket science, is it? Like, really? I mean, and I think, I can't remember whether I mentioned this in our last chat, but I spent a lot of money in my PhD, not a lot of my own money, a lot of university money. I did stabilisotope infusions. I measured every hormone under the sun, every biochemical analysis that you could possibly do in cyclists who we were overreaching and trying to get incredibly tired. The best, the most consistent and accurate descriptor to predict whether they were going to underperform was how they felt. I could have saved a lot of money and just asked them some simple mood questions. How do they feel? Are they happy? That's a great, and an experienced coach like that doesn't surprise me that, that's what one of his, I think, getting back to the simple sometimes is the way to do it.
But I think the power in it is in the research, obviously underpinning that our body has a good alert system. It tells us, it sends us messages, and let's trust it. Let's listen more.
Yeah.
Simple, but obviously not without its challenging application. Shona, this concept of belief effects in recovery, I'm assuming that what we believe as athletes, practitioners, coaches, but more so, if we think from the athlete's lens, what we think about recovery matters in terms of, are we talking here about modalities, our belief in the modality, or are we talking about our belief about the importance of it? Can you share a few thoughts around this idea of belief effects in recovery?
Yeah, so I think, I've always been fascinated by the placebo effect and belief effects, and Trent Stellingworth out of Canada, who's obviously a great scientist and great practical applied scientist as well, and he made this comment once around, and I don't know if he was the first to say it, but he was the first person that I heard say it. And he said, it's interesting, we have pretty much everything in sports science. When you do a research study, it's like a 2% improvement, but you add them all together and you don't get a 10% improvement, right? So it's not like you add nutrition and you add compression and you add ice baths and you add sleep and you add all these things and it improves your performance by a multiplication of all of those. So it's kind of like how much of these interventions and these improvements are we seeing are around just the fact that we're intervening, and maybe that, there's a pretty powerful placebo or belief effect associated. And I think for me, one of the things that I think is important is that, we know now around the science of belief and that it changes the brain, and expectation changes the brain in terms of activation of different parts of the brain. So, some classic studies done where you give people a $10 bottle of wine, but tell them it's a $90 bottle of wine, and their brain will light up like it's a $90 bottle of wine. They put people in scans and they look at their brain. So it's real. We know there's parts of the brain that change, that are the pleasure centers of the brain that is associated with believing in something, expecting that something is going to work. And we sort of did something with down this line with compression, and we did compression as a recovery strategy between 2 bouts of exercise. And then at the start of the study, we asked everyone, how much do you believe compression works? From 0, absolutely doesn't work, to 100. And then what we did is we looked back and we just said, well, did it work better? Did compression work better for those who believed in it more? And the answer was yes. I mean, we did find that compression was good for recovery overall, but it was even better, like it worked better in those participants that believed in it. So I think that's really important for practitioners. And now I think we need to be really careful because there's a lot of gurus out there, and Brad, I'm sure you get hit up by every man and his dog to sell something. And so there's a lot of things out there that is just junk science, right? But I think we have these things that we have some good science on that works. Like, we've got some good science on compression and ice baths and nutrition. And so if you educate the athlete and have them have a sense of belief that this, I believe in this because it's backed in science, then you might have an even better chance of those recovery strategies actually working for them, a multiplication potentially. When we're working with athletes as well, if they say, if I have a really experienced athlete that says to me, I have tried ice baths, I've used them a lot, I just don't feel they work for me. And you trust them, they're just not being, they're not just complaining. They really say, look, hot water works much, much better for me. and that's what they believe. I think, as I was saying earlier, we don't have a huge amount of science to say absolutely you should be doing this strategy over this strategy based on you as an individual. So I think if someone believes in something and it's not going to be harmful, then I think, that's something that we as practitioners can sort of work with the individual around this belief. I guess the problem is we see a lot of now with social media and marketing and fancy things that get sold before they're tested, that sometimes there's a belief in something that may not actually work. Whereas what we want to do is let's have some belief through education and experience with strategies that actually really do work. And then if the athlete likes them as well and enjoys doing it and finds it's beneficial, then you've got the perfect combination.
And you use the education word that was bubbling in my mind as well around if the good science, as you said, is there to support a modality or a practice or a strategy, then it's up to the team, the people working with the athlete to translate that and educate them in a meaningful way so that their belief is there, apply it, and it should, as you say, be that nice winning combination.
Yeah. I think we just can't underestimate how powerful belief is. I mean, the science, it's a fascinating read around placebos in medicine, and all the interesting things that has been done in that world is absolutely fascinating. But I think there's ways that we can harness that. I think we just have to make sure that we're doing it in a good and ethical manner, rather than selling people. It's easy to sell people things that might not work, and that's, some people would say that that's okay. The athlete believes in it and they feel good, then that's all that matters. But my preference is obviously to work with the athlete and teach them and educate them, have them believe in something that we also know has got some good science backing to it.
In Australia, particularly your work at the Australian Institute of Sport, it really has been a world global leader in unearthing that evidence-based approach to recovery, correct?
We did. We did take a pretty reasonably thorough, I think, look at as many recovery strategies as we could. And I think that's for lots of reasons. I think Australia is very evidence-based. As physiologists, we also work with medical practitioners and physiotherapists and psychologists who are all obviously very well educated and highly trained. And, we're all a bit sceptical. And it's like, I think we want to prove that this actually does work. But also, if it doesn't work, we also want to make sure we're not wasting our athletes' time on things that have that don't have a good evidence base. So, and also I think when you do research, you always end up understanding more than just does it work or does it not work. Ideally you also kind of find out what some of the mechanisms are, and then you can go, oh, okay, well, ice baths work through temperature and hydrostatic pressure. Okay, well, let's think about now how we can design facilities or how we can use in a practical environment, what's the best way to make sure that these mechanisms are actually working as well. So, I'm biased. I love the research. I think that it's really important for lots of different aspects. But yeah, we are pretty evidence-based here, and everyone will say, but does it work? But does it work? So you want to be able to say, we think so.
There's the papers. Shona, the belief effect makes me think of Alex Hutchinson's book Endure, where there's a chapter in there around, I think I summarised it, this was his statement, but belief in the training itself is as important as the training itself. And I think he arrived at that from obviously exploring the research or something, but it sort of flows on, I guess, with the recovery side of things as well.
Yeah, no, for sure. I think, having some confidence in that what you're doing is the right thing to do and you're not second guessing yourself, and it's really powerful to and it's funny because you often see, you see a team of athletes and they'll all of a sudden just have a new coach because they've sacked the old coach. It's exactly the same team, and all of a sudden they'll start winning. And it's like all of a sudden now they're hearing the press or the hype, or the new coach comes in and the board and the high performance manager saying, we've got this new coach and he is amazing or she is fantastic and she's done this with these, with these other people. And all of a sudden there's belief. And because you think they're not a different team of players to the week before. So yeah, sometimes I think that belief effect is super powerful, and we probably underestimate it more than we should.
That's powerful in itself. Shona, you mentioned back on episode 190, we can't hack our way to good recovery. There is no hack. We recently featured an expert in the field of the flow state, Rian Norris, and his phrase was, we can't hack flow. It's more mechanistic than probabilistic, I think he said. And it makes me think about we're sharing around modalities and belief, and most athletes will immediately think of the air compression boots, the recovery, the garments, the baths, the recovery centres, which all have their place, of course, in the landscape. But you did remind us in episode 190 that the pillars are still good nutrition and sleep. And sleep is one of the modules that I know you will be exploring in more detail with the upcoming live stream. But would you share any thoughts in this current challenging time around maybe a takeaway for people to consider with their training, with their sleep through COVID, for example?
Yeah, sleep's been one of the things that we're starting to see some research coming out around sleep and COVID, and obviously very different depending on your life situation, the country you're in, your training. There's so many different factors, but we're seeing a couple of things. We are seeing some people having quite disturbed sleep, which may be stress related, but we are also seeing some people that are getting improved sleep, and that may be because they have less travel time. You're at home, you don't have a commute. It may be also that people are allowed to sleep more to their natural biological preference. So, you might be a night owl, but life forces you to get up really early in the morning because you've got to do a job and you've got to train and you've got all these other things. So if your work, you're just doing it from home and you can potentially sleep at a different time than you normally would, then that may be advantageous to some people. So I think it's just really, we're sort of seeing a little bit of both. I think as a general rule in Australia, we've been relatively, obviously, prepared and had relatively some good outcomes here in Australia compared to other countries, although we do feel for our Melbournians. But look, I think there's been some challenges around it in terms of sleep and people in financial situations that are difficult and inability to train, etc. But then there's potentially some positives there as well.
It's a mixed bag. I've certainly observed clinically in my work as a physio quite a few patients, clients, if you like, who have had really quite transformative health journeys through COVID for the better, who have been working from home, sleeping, not commuting, having time to exercise, making time or having the extra time to exercise. And then you also see the other people who, of course, are under pressure and financially or whatever it may be. So a mixed bag. And with the upcoming live stream, you've termed that module Sleep Science, Optimization and Essentials. So I will be sitting there with a pen and paper myself, Shona, to take more notes. And I recall on episode 190, it was so simple but so powerful. You said, sleep. Some things are meant to happen when you're awake and some things are meant to happen when you're asleep. If we're not sleeping, those things that are meant to happen won't happen.
Yeah. I mean, I think it's Matthew Walker's book. He says somewhere at the start, if we weren't meant to sleep a third of our lives, then Mother Nature made a big mistake, because it biologically it doesn't make, like, we're not efficient during that time. I mean, we can't work, we can't hunt, we can't, there's all kinds of reasons why, it doesn't make sense to sleep a third of your life unless there's a real reason for it. And it is, and it's probably, since we last spoke, it is probably the area that has really increased the most in terms of our knowledge, not just in athletes, but in the general population and in health. Your comment about hacking recovery, and I still 99% agree with my previous comment, but because people now want to know, can you hack your sleep? Can you hack sleep? Can you hack sleep? I'm like, no, you can't. It's one of you just can't get away with, hacking your sleep. But maybe you can hack your day. Maybe you can plan your day better. Maybe you can do things during the day to make sure that you're not interfering with your sleep or you're optimizing your sleep. And when I say hack, it's probably not the right word for, what you could do during the day, but it's just like, let's just not try to have the simple, we all want this simple, quick, high-tech solution, to the problem with sleep, which is a very low-tech, simple thing to do. So I think planning our days better and, managing stress if we can, avoiding the caffeine in the afternoons if we can, just doing things to be smart about our day rather than going daytime is all that matters. And, sleep's just that secondary function that unfortunately we have to do, which is a total waste of time. Instead of having that approach, having the approach of let's do all the good things that we can do in our day to set ourselves up to be great during the day, but also to have good sleep at night. And, the thing that is also, I think, really important is that, yes, the sleep, get preparing for the day, have the day really good, have the night really good, means that the next day, your chances of having a good day are greater. You have a good sleep, the chance of your next day and the flow-on effects from that are quite powerful. So, I think the days of just, sleep's that little thing that we do at the end of the day. People's philosophies around that are really changing now, which is a good thing.
You're listening to Associate Professor Shona Halson on this, an expert edition on all things belief effects in recovery and periodising recovery for the athlete. If you missed last week's episode, it was an interest edition featuring prolific running author Ashwanden Finn, author of his most recent book, The Rise of the Ultra Runners. And last week's episode was an exploration of the world of ultra running. It was full of great stories and useful learnings, and here's a snippet of my conversation with Ashwanden.
I did it in the middle of 2 other ultra runs, which was probably wise. I had a couple of weeks before I'd done a 135-mile run, and a couple of weeks after I was doing a 100-mile in the mountain. And I was still, at this point, I hadn't done anything that far, so this was quite an intense period of time. So I kind of probably came into it not super well prepared.
To enjoy the full episode featuring Ashwanden, be sure to jump back to the archives wherever it is that you enjoy your podcast from, and whilst there, peruse the back catalogue of the shows, interest editions, expert editions, featured performers, and coaches' corners, dating right back to episode 1 featuring Australian surf lifesaving Ironman champion Ali Day. For now, let's jump back with this week's featured guest, none other than Associate Professor Shona Halson, on her return out into the Physical Performance Show on all things periodising recovery for the athlete and belief effects in recovery.
Shona, as always, this is such a fascinating area to explore. With the upcoming live stream, you shared today on the importance of education and having been around in my little world, the endurance world, really since I was 11, you were one of the forces that made me start to really appreciate the fact that recovery matters. And once again, as you've shared, the only training we're benefiting from is the training we're recovering from. So it seems like such an oversight from athletes, coaches, practitioners to not understand the best evidence base behind recovery strategies and focus entirely on the training strategies. And this live stream that I have reached out to you to be part of, we've reached out to you to be part of, excites me because it's one of the things that excites me most is we're trying to make it easily accessible. Obviously, it's not requiring anyone to be in a conference room. Used to these digital interfaces now for meetings, a low-cost vehicle to get some of this evidence-based information. What encouragement might you give to someone that's out there thinking, I can't give up a Saturday afternoon for 3 hours to listen to a live stream? What are the things you want them to take out of the work you're putting into preparing this live stream and delivery of it?
Yeah, I think, what I've tried to focus on is, yes, the education side of things, but also the practical tips. And I think when you look at things like sleep, I think a lot of the mistakes that people make are really simple things that maybe they don't realise they're doing. People have slept the same way their whole life. They don't realise that what they're doing might be a little odd. And so I think that some of the simple things around recovery are quite powerful in terms of long-term health and well-being. So it's not just about, your time as a high-level athlete. It's also, sleep's obviously important and your ability to recover and be healthy is important for longevity. So, 3 hours is not a short period of time. But I think also when you understand how some of these strategies are working, it means you're probably more likely to pick good pick good strategies and also make them work for you. And especially with some of the recovery strategies, there's not the science is there, but there's also some not great science, and to filter through that and just say, look, this is what we know right now. Ice baths, yes, no, when, maybe. Like, you save people reading, 3 hours is better than reading like 4 weeks of journal articles on the cold water immersion.
We'll leave that to you, Associate Professor. No, look, we're really excited, Shona. It's only a matter of weeks away. And thank you once again for your contribution in helping listeners of this show with their learnings. It's a tradition. You've been here once before, and your last physical challenge was something I still think about when I find myself getting stuck with my buttocks to the couch at the end of a day. And I think just another YouTube video, it won't hurt. I hear your voice saying, get up and get to bed. That was your prior physical challenge. What is Shona Halson's 2020 physical challenge going to be to listeners to help them perform at their physical best?
Yeah, look, I always have so many things going on in my head when you ask questions like this, because I think there's so many different roads that you could take. But look, I think my one is going to go back to general, which is, general applies for recovery and it applies to sleep. And that's really around that self-reflection aspect and really paying attention to whether you're monitoring yourself with something, objective or subjective, whatever it is, but really having that self-reflection to look and go, is this working for me? Do I believe in it? And I think looking at that belief aspect for your self-reflection and how important is it in believing something to you for your recovery. But yeah, that focus on self-reflection, I think, is if everyone can this week self-reflect a little bit more on their training, on their recovery, how they're doing things, how they're feeling, I think it can bring some really powerful insights.
Dr. Shona Halson, thank you once again for your contribution, and we'll see you in several weeks on the live stream.
Look forward to it, Brad. Thank you.
So there you have it, another episode of the Physical Performance Show, and I trust and I know you enjoyed this expert edition. And yes, it is a teaser to the upcoming live stream event, of which we are just over 2 weeks away from, Recovery Essentials for Optimal Performance, the 24th of October, 3 to 6 p.m. Australian Eastern Standard Time. If you are overseas and wish to benefit from this learning opportunity, be sure to still go ahead and register pogophysio.com.au/Dr. Shona Halson live stream, as a post-event recording will be made available to all participants. Now be sure to reach out and let Shona know what it was that you took away from her sharings today. You'll find Shona over on Twitter at Shona Halson, Halson. A massive thanks to the great folk who make this show possible each and every week. Daryl Misson, our audio engineer, Susan Wilkin on all things show administration, Matthew Walding on all things show graphic design, and Lily Burden assisting behind the scenes on all things social media. Another massive thanks to those leaving ratings and reviews over on iTunes, and also for those hitting subscribe and getting the show into your earbuds each and every week. Of course, keep the podsies coming. They are a whole lot of fun. Simply tag in the show at Physical Performance Show over on Instagram, or follow along over on Facebook at The Physical Performance Show. And if you know someone in your athletic world who would benefit from the learnings taken from today's episode, be sure to share the link with them and spread the performance love around. Now, coming up on next week's episode of the Physical Performance Show, we jump over to another expert edition featuring Ollie Williamson, Senior Physiotherapist for the English Institute of Sport and British Triathlon. And we explore all things swim, bike, run, injuries, prevention and treatment. Ollie's work sees him look after some of the planet's best triathletes, including prior featured guest of the show, Johnny Brownlee. So be sure to be tuning in next week for some great learnings around all things swim, bike, run, injuries. Until then, keep pursuing your physical best performance. I'm Brad Beer, and this has been the Physical Performance Show.